Okay, we are on a very short series on the topic of speaking in tongues primarily. It ties into the other sign gifts as well, but I'm not leaning towards the other sign gifts this much in this one as I have in the past. This one's just kind of an overview dealing with this idea of tongues. Way back when, there were only a couple of churches that even practiced this stuff. The Pentecostal churches did. But it's drifting into mainstream Protestant churches nowadays, and even in some Baptist churches. So it's important that we know what it is, because you're going to run into people that are doing this kind of stuff, and it's important that we know what the gift actually was, and when it existed, and when it passed out, and what it was used for, and so forth. Now, last week, we looked at a couple of things, just to bring us up to speed here. We saw that there were two primary purposes of the sign gifts, including tongues. The first was to confirm the word of a prophet. How do you know that this prophet is from God and the other one isn't? Well, the one that had the signs was the one that was from God. The second was to convict the unbelieving rulers of the Jews of their apostasy. During the first century, you had two groups on planet Earth that both claimed the same God. You had the Jews in the temple in Jerusalem, and you had the Christians. Now, prior to the Christians coming along, prior to the time of Christ, the Jews had all the signs. There were all kinds of miracles that happened in conjunction with that temple on a daily basis. It was a constant type of a thing. Then when Christ died and the veil in the temple was rent, the signs quit. The Jews didn't have them anymore. All of those miracles that just always happened no longer happened with the Jews, but they started happening with the Christians. So you got two groups of people both claiming the same God. Which one do you think is the right one? Ones that have got the signs, obviously. Well, then in 70 AD, the Jews were wiped off the planet. Jerusalem was trodden down to nothing left of it. No reason to have sign gifts for that purpose anymore, was there? There's no reason for it anymore. Because there's no miracles going on in a temple that no longer exists, so we don't need them for that. And shortly after that time, the Bible was completed, the prophecy was finished. There was no need to confirm the word of a prophet any longer. No reason to have the sign gifts. Remember, we looked at that verse over in Psalms. It said, we see no prophets, and there's no more signs. No prophets, no signs. The two go hand in hand on that. We also saw the characteristics of the gift of tongues, in particular in the New Testament. And one of the primary characteristics is that the gift of tongues was the ability to speak in a known human language. So, God sends me to Germany to evangelize Germany. I don't speak German. How in the world am I going to go to Germany? I guess I could use Google Translate and talk into my phone or something. That's going to be kind of hard to preach that way. But no, God would give the man the ability to speak in German so that he could spread the gospel. You look at the Apostle Paul in all the areas that he went. You think he was speaking Hebrew in Spain? Of course not. They don't speak Hebrew in Spain, they speak Spanish. So wherever he went, he had the ability to be able to speak in the dialect of the people where he was going. We don't need that now. We have the Bible. Okay? So that's what the gift of tongues was. He also taught that interpretation is more important than speaking in tongues. Now, here's an interesting note. If any of you that have been in charismatic churches, you know what they do. You've seen someone stand up and blah, 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 and then someone translates what they say. And they call that interpretation. That's not the primary meaning of the word interpretation, folks. You look it up in a dictionary. We define biblical terms by their primary meanings unless it creates a contradiction or an absurdity. And the primary meaning of interpret is to explain what is said. That's what a pastor does. He reads a verse and explains it. That's what interpretation is. Not translate it. Translate it is down, I don't know, number 7 or 8 on the list. But interpret means explain, go into detail. And then we looked at this fallacy of a prayer language, and we discussed that last week. And that brings us up to where we are today. And this is something I'm going to go into. Usually I bring this up, I fly through it in a minute and a half and let it go. Today I'm going to go into some detail on it. And that's because there have been questions, not from anybody in here, but I have received questions on this. And there have been questions floating around. So I need to answer questions. And it's a good time to just go ahead and nail down something, because this is one of those points that can be taken to the extreme on one side or another, not be in the middle somewhere like we generally like to be, but go to one extreme or another, and create problems. So I want you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 14, and we're going to look at verses 34 and 35. First Corinthians 14, 34 and 35. Verse 34, let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for a woman to speak in the church. Now, I have never seen a church that takes this to the full extent. I mean, if we're gonna go as far one side as we possibly can, then ladies, from the time you walk in the door, you can't open your mouth until you leave. I've never seen a church do that don't let the women visit after the church service, okay? So it's obviously not talking about that, okay? If my wife comes from a family of, unfortunately, people that have a lot of heart trouble. And so if I were to glance over there and see her grab her chest, I'm going to ask her what's wrong, and I expect her to answer me. So it's not talking about that. If I ask women a question in the church, they don't have to send me a note or a text. They can actually verbalize the answer. So that's not what it's talking about, right? We've had women that have joined the church, and what do? I bring them up here and have them verbalize to you why they want to join the church. So it can't be talking about that. There's got to be a specific type of speech that we're talking about here. And so I want to actually, because there are churches that take this way too far in one direction. And there are churches that take it just ignore it, just absolutely ignore it. On the one side, we're not going to ignore it, but I want to look at why it says that. What kind of speech are we talking about here? And it's, if we look at all the verses, we will see it. Let me say this. I was trained by Elder Conrad Jarrell and Elder Ben Mott. we land on the same side of this. I don't know where anybody else lands because I don't pay attention to anybody else. Those are the men that ordained me, and they're the ones that I really listen to. So as far as anybody else, I don't know what you're going to find in other places. But I know what we've taught. Okay, so women are not permitted to speak in the church. It also says here, but they're commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. Now, the passage for that is found over in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 16, and it's right after the fall when God is addressing Eve. Genesis chapter 3, verse 16. Unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. Just a side note here. The reason there's so many people wandering around on planet Earth is because of this curse. Because she was only going to have so many babies until she ate of the fruit. And the payment for eating of the fruit is you're going to have a whole bunch more babies than you were going to have. And that answers the question as to where did all these non-elect folk come from? Right there. There was no plan ever made for them. You know, people will sometimes say, well, it's not fair that God saves some and doesn't save the others. He saved the ones that were going to be here to start with had Adam and Eve never sinned in the Garden of Eden. But since they sinned in the Garden of Eden, she had more babies, and there was no provision ever made for them. And that would, ladies, would that multiply your sorrow? If you knew that you were going to have children, many of which weren't going to heaven, that would multiply my sorrow. I know of people that didn't want to have children for fear that they would end up going to hell. That would multiply sorrow. So anytime that you want to take issue with God over election, it ain't God's fault, folks. It's Adam and Eve's. That's the reason that they're here. But that's not the point I'm looking at. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. Oh, there's one for modern days that'll send shivers up and down the spine of Nancy Pelosi. He shall rule over thee. That's where it says it in the law. Women are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. Obedience is defined as the action or practice of obeying or doing what one is bidden. The fact or quality of being obedient, submissive to the rule of or authority of another, compliance with performance of a command, law, etc. Question. Who are women to be obedient to? Well, in the home, women are commanded to be obedient to their husbands. Now, this is another one of those areas where people can go way too far one way or way too far the other way. There were people in the Las Vegas church at one time, and please forgive my the description I'm going to give. We had a member in the Las Vegas church at one time that argued with the pastor that if he demanded that his wife jump up on a table naked and dance before him, that she had to do it because of that verse. And he got shot down for it as well. Gentlemen, let me give you a little bit of advice and a warning. because this is how it really works. I don't want to spend a whole hour and a half dealing with this one topic, so I'm going to push on the pedal here. You should listen to your wife. You should pay close attention to what they have to say. When it comes to an issue, you're not the smartest thing that's ever walked on the face of planet Earth, and two are better than one. And I hate to admit this, but just about every time that Wendy and I have gotten into one of these matches, after I've really thought about it, I have to eat crow feathers and admit that she was right. So listen to your wives, okay? Now here's the bad news. You're the one that is cursed with having to make the decisions. It ain't a blessing, guys. It's a curse. We're cursed with having to make the call. So if you wimp out and say, well, you just do it because I don't want to, well, you can't. It's your decision. You have to make the decision. Now, wives, you should have all of the input that you can possibly have up until the point that the decision has to be made. And then once the husband makes the decision, you got to live with it. You don't go against him. You don't try to make the whole thing fall apart because you don't like the way the decision was made. That ain't Jim talking. That's God talking. That's the way this is organized. So men, pay attention to what they have to say. They know more than we do on most of this stuff. On most of the stuff you have, when you're dealing with your children, when you're dealing with, give you an example. Oh, and here's one for you. And this applies to parents as well. When you're dealing with your kids, and husbands, when you're dealing with your wives, if there's any way in the world to say yes, say yes. Why live in misery? It makes no sense. If what they're asking for isn't sinful and it's not that big of a deal, say yes as often as you possibly can. Because then when you have to say no, you're not the parent or the husband that always just says no, 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 no. So if you can say yes, I'll give you an example. Was it a couple of years ago, I think it was, Wendy and I had to go find a new car for her. And we went to the Mini dealer because we figured we could get a better deal on the old car than we could at a Chevy dealer. We went to a Chevy dealer and then after that went to the Mini dealer. Now, there were four cars that we could test drive right there that day that met with what Wendy was looking for. 3 new ones. Oh, and the salesman said, if they don't work, we'll find something else. But there were 3 brand new ones, and there was 1 used one. And the used one belonged to a guy that lived primarily in Illinois, and he would come to Florida for the winters. And remember, this was during COVID, so he hadn't been down here. So the used one had, I think, 3,200 miles on it or something like that, and he had just traded it in on another one that looked exactly like it. And it was a little red convertible, which is the car that Wendy actually wanted. So when we got down to look at these cars, and the salesman's got his hands full of keys, and he says, which one do you want to test drive first? I said, the little red convertible, because I know my wife. So while we were driving the convertible, as we were coming back to the lot, she said, which one do you think we should drive next? And I said, do you really need to? And she said, no. So we bought the convertible. Say yes if you can. It just makes your life so much easier. But you're still the chump that's stuck with having to make the decision. And you got to live with it. And wives, if you've done the best you can to try to explain what to do and the bonehead goes the wrong way anyway, don't worry. God will take care of him. It'll work itself out somehow. He'll learn eventually. For some of us, our skulls are thicker than others, and it takes a few lessons, but he'll learn eventually. Now we've talked about the home, but that's not what this passage is talking about. Let's get back to where we are. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Paul is not giving instruction on what women should do in the house or in the home. He's giving instruction as to what women should do in the church. These are instructions for behavior in the church. And also, we're going to look at a passage over in 1 Timothy that's going to support this, and it's talking about in the church as well. So that's what we're zeroing in on, is talking about in the church. Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it's a shame for a woman to speak in the church. Okay? So, let me just put it bluntly, and then we'll look at another passage. Women are not to disrupt the service by asking questions. So if I'm preaching and you don't understand something, don't talk about it. Make a note of it and get to it, deal with it later. Don't interrupt the service. Don't raise your hand and want to ask a question in the middle of the preaching. First off, women are commanded not to do it. Men better know better. It's just not an appropriate thing to do, but women are actually have the commandment not to do it. Now look at 1 Timothy chapter 2, and I'll show you another point on this topic. 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 11. Let the women learn in silence with all subjection. Let the women learn in silence. The word learn means to acquire knowledge of a subject, a skill, an art, as a result of study, experience, or teaching. With all subjection. Subjection means the action, state, or process of being submissive or subject to another. Submission, obedience, homage. Now, who are they supposed to be in subjection to in the church? We know in the home it's your husband. Who is it in the church? It's the pastor. He's the one doing the teaching, right? Now, we haven't had any of these issues happen here in Lakeland, Florida. We got close one time, but we haven't had any of the types of issues that have happened in churches like, say, Detroit or Las Vegas, where actual church courts were opened and you had testimony from different members of the church. But I do remember when we got close to one of them, the pastor letting the women know, if you have questions about this, make sure and ask your husband ahead of time so that he can ask the questions when we get to the church to comply with this. Okay? So if Sheila had a question about something, she could talk to Kevin and she could say, Kevin, she could write him a note. Kevin, can you ask this? And Kevin has the right to ask the question in the church court. Not having, what do we got, almost 50 people in here? Well, that cuts the chaos down in half, right? Because half of you are men and half of you are women. We just got rid of half of it. So when it comes to those types of issues, which we haven't seen here yet, but have happened, it helps with the process. And I've already talked about this, that in the church, women aren't to talk over, interrupt, shout out questions, get into arguments, contradict, or heckle the pastor. Men, you better not do it either. It's not going to be met with a smile. It's bad manners, but women are commanded not to do it. But it's not talking about other types of speaking in the church. Here's the hooker. Look at verse 12. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. And there's where the rubber really meets the road. I suffer not a woman to teach. They are not to teach or to usurp authority over the man. Usurp means to appropriate or seize wrongfully or forcibly, and related uses, to appropriate wrongfully to oneself a right to intrude forcibly, illegally, or without just cause into some dignified or important office, position, etc., to assume or aggregate to oneself political power, rule, authority, etc., by force, or to claim unjustly. That's what usurp means. Authority is power derived from or conferred by another. The right to act in a specified way, delegated from one person or organization to another. Official permission, authorization, and an instance of this. Remember what we're talking about, folks. We're talking about what goes on in the church. Who is it that's delegated the authority to teach in the church? The pastor. Out in the world, women, you can teach all you want to. I've said this before, if the Pope invites you, go. Stand there at St. Peter's and preach election. But not here. God decides who's going to stand here. And over in 1 Timothy chapter 3, you don't need to turn here, but in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 2, and in Titus chapter 1 and verse 6, both of those passages say, referring to a pastor, that he shall be the husband of one wife. In both passages, the word bishop and husband are singular masculine, wife is singular feminine. Now, you say, why am I spending all this time relative to this study? How many of you have ever gone to one of these charismatic tongue-speaking churches? Raise your hands. How many of you have seen women being the ones that 95% of the time do the speaking in tongues in one of these churches? And are they not teaching at that point? Yeah. And they're usurping the authority of the pastor when they do it. That's what Paul's talking about, folks, right there. Women aren't to be pastors. And they're to stay silent when it comes to teaching that goes on in this church. If someone all of a sudden Rosie, if you had a problem and had to whisper to Mike, I need to leave the room, but it's okay, but I'm okay, it's no big deal. That's not an excludable offense. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about stealing the authority from someone else and ruling in the church. You're not to do that. Women are not to do that. Okay? So see, it doesn't sound as bad as you might have thought. And you know what? I've met some of these women that don't have a problem usurping the authority of a pastor in a church. I got to tell you, they got no problem usurping the authority of the husband either. If you've ever heard the term that she's the one that wears the pants in the family, well, that's what you got. And that's not to go on in the church. It's not to go on in the home either. It's just not, things aren't going to, but see this, again, it's moderate. We're in the middle here. If any husband decides that he wants to abuse his wife the way that the people in Vegas did, well, you're going to have a whole bunch of us come after you and just beat the tar out of you. You ought to be horsewhipped for thinking that kind of stuff, and I'm willing to tie you to a post and do it. But on the other hand, don't be the guy that just wimps out. I told Wendy I was going to ask this, so I'm allowed to, even though I've moved on. For those of you that have met my wife, and most of you have, if you haven't, she's sitting right over here. How many of you think that she's some sort of a wallflower that never gets her point across with me? Anybody? Any Bueller? Anybody? Have any of you that knew Elder Gerald or have met Mary Dell Gerald, how many of you think she would be a wallflower that never got her point? You know, Wendy and I have sat in their living room, I don't know how many times, listening to Mary Dell tell Conrad just exactly how the cow ate the cabbage. She wouldn't do it in the church, and you know what? I spent 25 years learning how to be a pastor from Conrad, and Wendy spent 25 years learning how to be a pastor's wife from Mary Dell. There's your example, women. And notice, she doesn't speak in the church unless I ask her a question. And that's really what it amounts to. It doesn't take any power away from the wife or the woman at all. I give more respect to women than I do to most men, but we just have to do things in order. And Paul could see that the day was coming when this was going to be an issue, when there were going to be women standing in pulpits, and there were going to be women that were usurping the authority that God had given to the man. Okay, so that's what that one deals with. Oh man, I used a lot of time on that. Okay. Now let's get back to everything else. One of the things that charismatic churches also seem to teach is they want everybody to speak in tongues. If you've ever been to one of these things, you know that they expect you, if they baptize you, they expect when you come out of the water, you're supposed to be, going on in some sort of unintelligible gibberish. That's what they look for. They think that gift was designed for everybody. Okay, it wasn't. Gift of tongues was not intended for everybody. 1 Corinthians chapter 12. First, we'll look at verses 8 through 11. 1 Corinthians 12, verse 8. For one is given the Spirit, by the Spirit, the word of wisdom, to one. To another, the word of knowledge by the same Spirit. To another, faith by the same Spirit. To another, gifts of healing by the same Spirit. To another, the working of miracles. To another, prophecy. To another, discerning of spirits. To another, diverse kinds of tongues. To another, interpretation. See, God gave these gifts out to different people within the church so that, just like when we see the passages in the Bible where it talks about the church being like a body. And the question is asked, if everybody were an ear, well, where would the speaking be, or however it is it's phrased? Not everybody is an ear. Not everybody is a nose. Not everybody is a hand. We're different parts. And these gifts were all given to different people within the church so that the church could operate as a whole. In verse 28, he says, "And God hath set some in the church, first apostles, secondarily prophets, thirdly teachers, after that miracles, then gifts of healing, helps, governments, diversities of tongues." And he asked the question in verse 29, are all apostles? Obviously the answer is no. Are all prophets? No. Are all teachers? No. Are all workers of miracles? No. Have all the gifts of healing? No. Do all speak with tongues? No. And yet that's what charismatic churches expect. Exactly the opposite of what we're taught by Paul and the apostles. Let me show you another one quickly. Look over at Matthew chapter 7. Because another thing that they teach in charismatic churches is that this is how you know, this is how you get the evidence that you're born again. You speak in tongues, right? I showed you last week that tongues are a sign not for them that believe, but for them that believe not. Remember? But that's what they teach. So you're born again, you speak in tongues, that proves that you're born again, you're a child of God, you're going to heaven, right? These sign gifts were sent to, according to them, to show you that you are going to heaven. Heaven's your home because you've got the sign gifts. Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 and 22. "Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. Many will say to me in that day," many, not just a couple, many will say to me in that day, "Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name? And in thy name have cast out devils, and in thy name done many wonderful works? And then I will profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity." Sign gifts don't prove that you're spiritual. They're not an evidence of the new birth. Because a whole bunch of folks that have got them aren't going where they think they're going. They don't evidence the new birth. You know something else? They don't even show that a church is spiritual. You would think that all these churches with all these spiritual gifts were the most spiritual of the churches. They're not. Not at all. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1. First Corinthians chapter 1, verses 4 through 7, just to make the point. 1 Corinthians 1, verse 4. "I thank my God always on your behalf for the grace of God, which is given you by Jesus Christ, that in everything ye are enriched by him in all utterance and in all knowledge, even as the testimony of Christ was confirmed in you, so that ye come behind in no gift, waiting for the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ." The church in Corinth had all the gifts. Out of all of the churches that you look at in the New Testament, the church in Corinth was the one that had the gifts. Look at chapter 3 and verse 1. "And I, brethren, could not speak unto you as unto spiritual, but as unto carnal, even as unto babes in Christ." So the church in Corinth had all the gifts. They weren't the most spiritual church that Paul dealt with. They were the babies. Now look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. This is the spiritual church. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 7 through 9. "So that ye were examples to all that believe in Macedonia and Achaia, for from you sounded out the word of the Lord, not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but also in every place your faith to Godward is spread abroad, so that we need not to speak anything, for they themselves show of us what manner of entering in we had unto you, and how ye turned to God from idols to serve the living and the true God. This was the spiritual church. Now look at 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. And this is the only mention that we find of spiritual gifts to the Thessalonian church, the spiritual church. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. Even him whose coming is after the working of Satan, with all power and signs and lying wonders, and with all deceivableness of unrighteousness in them that perish, because they receive not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. The only signs we hear of with the most spiritual church are the false signs and wonders that come in the last days, that are under the working of Satan. Spiritual gifts don't prove that a church is spiritual. Also, there's indication here. If you look at Micah, back in the Old Testament. And we want to look at Micah chapter 7. Flip too far. It's right after Jonah. Micah chapter 7, verses 14 through 15. Feed thy people with thy rod, the flock of thine heritage, which dwells solitarily in the wood, in the midst of Carmel. Let them feed in Bashan and Gilead as in the days of old. According to the days of thy coming out of the land of Egypt, will I show unto him marvelous things. This is a prophecy of Christ. And according to the days of the children of Israel coming out of the land of Egypt, there will be marvelous things. Now, marvelous things are synonymous with signs and wonders. In Psalm chapter 78, verses 10 through 17, Psalm 78:10, they kept not the covenant of God and refused to walk in his law and forgot his works and his wonders that he had showed them. Marvelous things did he in the sight of their fathers in the land of Egypt, in the field of Zoan. He divided the sea and caused them to pass through. He made the waters to stand as a heap. In the daytime also he led them with a cloud, and all the night with a light of fire. He clave the rocks in the wilderness and gave them drink out of the great depths. He brought streams also out of the rock and caused waters to run down like rivers. And they sinned yet more against him by provoking the Most High in the wilderness. While the children of Israel were in the wilderness, there were signs and wonders, one right on top of another one, right? Just go back and read the Old Testament relative to that. There was the rock that gave water. Every time there was a problem, another sign and wonder showed up. More so than probably at any other time other than when the Lord Jesus Christ was here. And it's referred to as marvelous things. So according to the days of thy coming out of the land of Egypt, will I show them marvelous things, signs and wonders. According to those days, there will be signs and wonders. And that's a prophecy of Christ. Okay? So with that, now let's look at Acts chapter 7. And verse 36. Acts 7:36, where the context of this is talking about Moses in the land of Egypt, or land of in the wilderness, coming out of Egypt, wandering around in the wilderness. And in verse 36, it says he brought them out. He's bringing them out of Egypt. After that, he had showed wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the wilderness 40 years. 40 years. According to the days of thy coming out of the land of Egypt, 40 years will I show them marvelous things, signs and wonders. Christ was crucified in 30 AD. Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. 40 years. During that 40-year period is when the signs and wonders were active. And I don't think that's a coincidence. There was a prophecy of the time, and it fits like a hand in a glove. That's where the signs and wonders were. Now look at who it is that we see speaking, that God speaks of these people that are working these signs and wonders. Look at Acts chapter 2 and verse 43. Acts chapter 2 and verse 43. And fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done by the apostles. By the apostles, these first generation Christians. Look at Acts chapter 5 and verse 12. And by the hands of the apostles were many signs and wonders wrought among the people, and they were all with one accord in Solomon's porch. The apostles again, Acts chapter 15 and verse 12. Then all the multitude kept silence and gave audience to Barnabas and Paul. Guess what? Barnabas and Paul were apostles. Gave audience to Barnabas and Paul, declaring what miracles and wonders God had wrought among the Gentiles by them, apostles. Look at, where am I at here? 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 12. Truly the signs of an apostle were wrought among you in all patience, in signs and wonders and mighty deeds. So the Bible speaks of the apostles being the ones that were working the signs and wonders. And there are indications that the signs were ending near the end of the apostles' lives. As their lives were coming to a close, we already start to see indications that these signs and wonders are going away. Remember, they were only here for 40 years, according to that period of time. So from Christ to the destruction of Jerusalem, that 40-year period, that's when the signs were active. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 5. And verse 23. Drink no longer water, but use a little wine for thy stomach's sake and for thine oft infirmities. Well, if you've got infirmities, why don't you just lay hands on yourself and heal yourself? You can't anymore. Signs are starting to pass out. So now he's giving different advice, right? He's not giving the Benny Hinn advice of just come forward and I'll lay hands on you and pray on you, you'll be okay. No. Start actually looking at what's in water when you're doing these traveling, and take a little bit more better care of yourself. Look at 2 Timothy chapter 4 in verse 20. Erastus abode at Corinth, but Trophimus have I left at Miletum sick. Why would the Apostle Paul leave him at Miletum sick if he still had the ability to heal him? You know who Trophimus was? You can read about him over in Acts chapter 20 and maybe 21. You remember the Apostle Paul was taken captive by the Jews because they claimed that he had brought a Gentile into the temple? And he ended up in jail as a result of that, had to ask or had to appeal to Caesar, ended up having to go to Rome because he had been in the temple supposedly with a Gentile. You know who the Gentile was? Trophimus. If one of my friends was that close to me and they were sick and I had the ability to heal them, I would have healed them. I wouldn't have just left them somewhere sick. It's not like Trophimus was just some run-of-the-mill random that he only met for a minute and a half. So you see, again, these signs are starting to fade out towards the end of the Apostle Paul's life, which was getting pretty close to that 40-year mark. And I'm missing the last page of this thing. It didn't print off. So, I'm going to have to wing it. Okay. Well, that's good. We're just about done anyway, right? There's a couple of points. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take the rest of this and stick it into something else because it'll fit into another sermon, and we'll just go ahead and wrap up for today. But there are a couple of points that I want you to see. The only signs and wonders that we see mentioned in the Bible after this 40-year period are those false signs and wonders that are worked by Satan in the latter days. Something I want you to understand, and I'm not going to have the time to go find the verses right now, but Satan does have the ability to fake things. He does not have the ability to create new. He only has the ability to copy things that have happened before. There's a reference to it over in 2 Timothy chapter 3 in verse 8, where it says, "Now as Jannes and Jambres withstood Moses, so do these also resist the truth. Men of corrupt minds reprobate concerning the faith, but they shall proceed no further, for their folly shall be manifest unto all men, as theirs also was." Now, if you remember what went on with Moses when he was standing before Pharaoh, and he would take his staff, God would tell him to take his staff and lay it down on the ground, and it would turn into a serpent. If you've ever watched the Ten Commandments, you'll remember Charlton Heston doing this stuff. And then there were these two magicians over here that would then put their sticks down, and their sticks would turn into serpents as well, right? That was Jannes and Jambres. The way they withstood Moses was by counterfeiting everything that Moses did. They never fixed anything. They never changed anything. When Moses would well, Moses would make a proclamation and God would send lice. They never got rid of them. When the flies came, they didn't get rid of the flies. They just gave you more flies. They made things worse. All they could do, and all Satan can do, is counterfeit. So tongues are a counterfeit of the real gift that's passed away. Now, as I said in the very beginning of this, there are some people that just fake it because of peer pressure. Nobody wants to be the guy that isn't able to keep up with the rest of the crowd. Nobody wants to be that. So you fake it. And there's a bunch of people that do. There's some that aren't faking it. And there's some that are doing it by the spirit of the devil. I'll give you another one. Another indication that we have in the scripture is that there were a lot of the people that Jesus healed of demons. He would cast demons out of them, but the manifestation of their demon possession wasn't that they were crazy people slicing their wrists up, and some of them were, but not all of them. Some of them were deaf, some of them were dumb, they couldn't hear, they couldn't speak, they had health issues. And when Jesus cast the demon out, the health issues went away, and they could see and they could hear. And if you think about Job, remember that Satan was the one that went after Job and caused him so many health problems when he was basically looked like some sort of a cancer or AIDS patient. Major league health issues, but it wasn't health so much as it was Satan oppressing the man. Now, let's look at a scenario. You've got somebody out here that's in a wheelchair that can't walk, or is blind and can't see, deaf and can't hear, and you wheel him into one of these Benny Hinn types, and Benny Hinn does his thing, and at that very moment, the demon that is causing these health problems says, let's leave. And they let the guy go. Well, now all of a sudden he can hear. Because it wasn't really deafness to begin with. It was demon possession. And the demon can come and go anytime he wants to. So the demon leaves. The man's well. And there's a passage that says that the second case is worse for that man than the first. Why? Because that guy that supposedly healed him, he owns him now. That guy will do anything for the guy that supposedly healed him when he was never really sick to start with. The illness was demon possession. Now there is one thing that I want to warn you of, and I've addressed this before. When it comes to demon possession, when you come across someone, don't try to exorcise a demon, whatever you do. You don't have the power to do that. We don't have those gifts. And you remember over in the book of Acts, there were a couple of guys that tried to pull that one off one time, and the demon said, I know Paul. I know Jesus and I know Paul, but I don't know you. And the demon came out and beat the soup out of that guy. So that's not how we deal with things in the New Testament. We don't do the exorcism nonsense that you see on television. The Catholic Church has been big into exorcism. Well, how do you know that that's not exactly what I just described of the guy that's got health problems? In order to support that false religion, the demon's in cahoots with the guy that's doing the exorcism. And at the right moment, he slips on out, the guy's well, and now we've got evidence that this father can do things that others can't. It's a sideshow, folks. It's just like a carnival sideshow. But it traps people into their system because the poor individuals that experience this kind of stuff, they experienced something, and it's hard for them to let go of. It's very hard for them to because they saw it, they witnessed it, or it happened to them, and to try to convince them of that is tough. So here's what we're told to do. I have to find it here. And of course, I can't find it. Chad, the servant of the Lord must not strive. Where's that at? Here it is, I found it. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 24. The servant of the Lord must not strive, but be gentle unto all men, apt to teach, patience, in meekness, instructing those that oppose themselves, if God peradventure will give them repentance to the acknowledging of the truth, and that they may recover themselves out of the snare of the devil, who are taken captive by him at his will. That's how you deal with it now. You find somebody that opposes themselves. And I like to think of this in the sense of, most of you know what this is like. Most of you going through conversion have at one time or another opposed yourself. You thought, well, wait a minute. This says this, but it has to be this over here. That can't be right. I mean, I'm reading it with my own eyes, but I've always been taught that it's this. And you're opposing yourself. All of us going through conversion, we usually end up arguing with ourselves. More so than when we argue with anybody else. I've always believed this, and now it's not lining up. Those are the people that you can actually approach. When you find someone like that is opposing themselves, well, how do you know? They usually ask questions. Usually start to ask questions. And you can tell if somebody's asking a question because they really want the answer, or if they're asking a question to try to trick you. You can usually tell. It doesn't take long for you to figure out if somebody's actually sincere or not. And if they're sincere and they're asking questions, then there's your instructions. Teach them, be meek, and pray that God will open their eyes to it. And that's how we have to deal with it now, not the way that they did back when the gifts were available. We don't have those anymore. Those things passed out almost 2,000 years ago. And any of them that you see now line up with the ones that we're going to see at the end of time that are worked by the power of Satan. With that, I thank you for your very kind and patient attention this morning. Let's stand and be dismissed in prayer.